Today's daf is daf tet in Masechet Sukkah. We are starting at the very top of the daf with the very top of the Amud with the new Mishnah. Sukkah Yeshana, an old Sukkah. Bet Shammai poselein or Bet Hillel machshirin. Bet Shammai says you cannot use an old Sukkah, and Bet Hillel says you can use one. Ve'ezoi Sukkah Yeshana. What is the definition of an old Sukkah? What do you mean by old sukkah? Kol she'asa'a kodem lehag shiloshim yom. Any sukkah that you made more than 30 days prior to Sukkot. Aval im asa'a l'shem chag. But if you made it for the sake of the holiday, afilo mitchilat hashana kishera. Then even according to Beit Shammai, in other words, if you explicitly intended for it to be for Sukkot, then even if you made it
2 months
and months before, it doesn't matter. The question is, if you constructed a sukkah that meets the requirements of Sukkot in 2 months before Sukkot, and you did not say anything. You didn't say anything. So according to Beit Shammai, that isn't good. It has to be within 30 days of the holiday. Because if it's within 30 days of the holiday, then from context, since you're studying, Rashi says the halachot already of Sukkah, you're studying the halachot 30 days before. So in context, we see that it's a Sukkah that's meant for Sukkot. If you explicitly said you wanted this to be for Sukkot, then for sure it's good according to everybody. The question between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is if it's 60 days, let's say, before Sukkot, and you didn't explicitly say this is for Sukkot, you just built the Sukkah, is that sufficient?
Even though you might have had in mind that this is going to be for Sukkot, you got to say it. You got to make a statement, or you have to have...
Well, it doesn't say necessarily that you have to specifically say it.
You got to have kavanah.
But you have to have intention, that you're not just building a Sukkah, I'm building this L'Shem Sukkah. Now, how do you have to verbalize it or not is not so clear, but certainly it has to be explicit, at least in your mind. Let's put it that way. The Gemara says, "My ta'amat Beit Shammai." What's the reasoning of Beit Shammai? Amar Kra, because Pasuk says, "Chag Sukkot Shivat Yamim Lashem." It says the holiday of Sukkot, 7 days devoted to Hashem, which means Sukkah Asuya Lashem Chag Ba'inan. That we need a Sukkah that was made for the sake of the holiday. And how do Beit Shammai derive that from the pasuk? So Rashi explains, "Dichtiv Sukkot Lashem," because it says Chag Sukkot Shivat Yamim Lashem. Sukkot has to be Lashem Hashem, Lashem Mitzvat HaMelech. Rashi says it has to be for the sake of the mitzvah of the king. So from the fact that it says the holiday of Sukkot, 7 days for Hashem, it means that the Sukkah has to be made for the mitzvah. Beit Hillel take that pasuk differently. Rav Sheshet, as Rav Sheshet says, Damar Rav Sheshet mishum Rabbi Akiva, because Rav Sheshet said in the name of Rabbi Akiva, Minayin la'atzeh sukkah sha'asurin kol shiv'ah. How do we know that one is not permitted to benefit from atzeh sukkah, from the wood of the sukkah? In other words, the structure of the sukkah has a kiddusha to it, it has a holiness to it, you can't benefit from it during Sukkot. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk tells you, Chag Sukkot Shivat Yamim Lashem, the holiday of Sukkot, 7 days for Hashem, meaning to say that the sukkah itself has kiddusha. That doesn't mean that when you construct this, but Beit Hillel will say, this doesn't mean that when you construct the sukkah you have to have some explicit intention in mind. What it's saying is that by default, in other words, de facto, during Sukkot, the sukkah that's being used for the mitzvah has Kedusha. And therefore you can't take the wood of the sukkah and use it for anything else.
It has Kedusha the rest of the year. It only has Kedusha on Sukkot.
Right, on Sukkot. That's right.
But it's for the mitzvah.
But the issue is, the chidush here is that it's not in the construction that you have to think to yourself, I'm making this L'Shem sukkah. Right. It's in the sukkah that you use. Whatever sukkah you're using for the mitzvah now has a certain quality of kedusha to it that you can't take, let's say, the wood of the sukkah, the wood of the walls or the sechach, and say I'm going to use it as a toothpick.
But it seems to indicate that's because it has kedusha.
So right, but so what?
So then.
Right.
Okay, so it's important to know that the kedusha only exists during the 7 days.
Right, but that doesn't. But that's not relevant to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. In other words, Beit Hillel is using that pasuk. The pasuk that says Shivat Yamim Lashem means that during Sukkot, the Sukkot that are being used have kedusha. That's different than Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai is saying that when you construct the sukkah, you have to have in mind to designate it as a sukkah. That's how they're disagreeing in the interpretation of the pasuk. According to Beit Hillel, you don't have to think to yourself or designate that this sukkah is going to be for Sukkot. It's that you used it and now it gets the quality of being a sukkah and having kedusha. Beit Shammai says no. When you construct it, it either has to be clear because you explicitly say it or because it's 30 days before that it's going to be used for Sukkot in advance. Okay? Beit Shammai is saying in advance you have to have that idea. Okay? Now, the Gemara goes on Vitanya, and we learned in a Braita, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, Keshem shechal shem shamayim ala chagiga, kach chal shem shamayim ala sukkah, shene'emar chag sukkot, shivat yamim lashem. That Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera learned a similar concept. He said, just like the shem shamayim, just like the name of heaven rests upon the chagiga, upon the korban chagiga, it has holiness. Rashi explains, one cannot eat of the meat of the chagiga until its inner parts are burnt on the altar. So there is a sense of kedusha with the chagiga. So too the sukkah has the same. How so? Because it says chag sukkot, and chag evokes an association to chagiga, to the korban. So just like the korban has a kedusha, kach chal shem shamayim ala sukkah, similarly does the name of God fall upon the sukkah. Shene'emar chag sukkot shvalim Lashem, ma chag lashem, af sukkah lashem. Just like the chag, just like the korban chagiga is devoted to God, so too the sukkah is devoted to Hashem. Ubeit Shammai nami miba'el hachi. But Beit Shammai, what do Beit Shammai do? Don't Beit Shammai agree that during Sukkot the sukkah has kedusha, it has holiness, and can't be misappropriated for other uses? What are they going to do now? Inachinami, that's true. Ela maitamayu de Beit Shammai. So they can't use that pasuk that we thought they were going to use because they need that pasuk of Chag Sukkot Shivat Yamim Lashem. They agree with Beit Hillel. So they can't use the pasuk for that. So what are they going to use? What pasuk are they going to use? Ketiv kra achrina Chag Sukkot ta'aseh lecha shiv'at yamim. It says Chag Sukkot you should make for yourself 7 days. It says ta'aseh lecha, you should make for yourself. Sukkah ha'asuya l'shem chag ba'inan. From the fact that it says Chag Sukkot ta'aseh lecha, right? You should make it. It means that you should make. Right, you have to have the kavanah when you make it. So Rashi explains, Chag Sukkot Taseh, you should switch the order of the words. Sukkot Taseh lechag. It says Chag Sukkot Taseh. You should make the holiday of Sukkot. He says you should switch the words around and say Sukkot, the booth, Ta'aseh, you should make lechag, for the holiday. He reverses the order of the words. So in any case, that's how he gets the idea that when you construct the sukkah, it has to be with the proper kavanah. Beit Hillel, what is Beit Hillel going to say about that? Beit Hillel comes along and says, no, that pasuk of Chag Sukkot Taseh lecha shivat yamim is to tell you that if you forgot to make a sukkah for the first days of the holiday, or you were away for the first days of the holiday and you came back in the middle of Chol HaMoed and you don't have a sukkah, that you're allowed to construct a sukkah during Chol HaMoed. Ubeit Shammai savira leho Rabbi Eliezer, the Amar en osin sukkah b'chulo shel moed, and Beit Shammai holds like Rabbi Eliezer, who says you can't make a sukkah in chol moed. In other words, since Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree about this other concept, Beit Shammai says you can't make a sukkah during chol moed. So therefore, he uses the pasuk of Chag Sukkot Taseh lecha shivat yamim to mean that when you make the sukkah, which must perforce be before Sukkot, according to Beit Shammai, you have to make it with the proper kavanah. And according to Beit Hillel, no. That pasuk is coming to tell you that if you didn't make a sukkah in the beginning of the holiday, you can make it during Chol HaMoed. But therefore, there's no extra pasuk to teach you that you must have kavanah when you construct the sukkah.
So Beit Shammai disagrees and says you can't make it during Chol HaMoed because of malacha.
He doesn't say why. He doesn't say why. Doesn't say why. Yeah, but I mean, it's not because of malacha probably. It's probably because of a concept that the sukkah has to be like an entity for the whole 7 days. You can't just make it a partial one. It has to be one that was created for the whole 7 days. And Ubeit Hillel let lehu de Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Are you telling me that Beit Hillel doesn't agree with the following halacha of Rabbi Yehuda that he said in the name of Rav? Now this halacha of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav has absolutely nothing to do with sukkah, but it has to do with kavanah, or doing something lishma, namely making tzitzit lishma. Does tzitzit have to be made lishma? For, with the kavanah, for the sake of the mitzvah. Because Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, Asa'ah min ha-kotzin, o min ha-nimin, o min ha-geradin, pesulah. Minasisin keshera. So what is this talking about? Rashi's interpretation is unlike the interpretation of the Rambam and the Geonim in this sugya, but we're just for simplicity's sake going to follow what Rashi says because it's easier actually to fit with this piece of Gemara the way that it's flowing in our text. So we're going to follow the way that Rashi has it. Mina kotzin means he interprets each of these cases, kotzin, nimin, and geradin. All of these examples are examples where the tzitzit were made out of pre-existing hanging threads on the garment. So, for instance, when it comes to what does he say is geradin? Geradin is what's hanging on the end of the talit when you finish sewing. In other words, the extra strings hanging off. Minakotzin. This is when when there are certain strings that stick out on the edges and they look like needles, so they look like thorns. So they're called kotzim. And normally you would cut them off the edge of the garment, but you don't do that here. Or nimin, he says this is talking about when you make a hem and the edge of the hem, the string that you wove the hem in with, you sewed the hem in with, is sticking out. So you might say, well, I already have string sticking out. I'll just make that the tzitzit out of that. Why do I have to add extra tzitzit? In all these cases, you have extra string that's already hanging off. Why can't you use it? So the answer is because it has to be put on lishma. You can't just use something that automatically came from the construction of the garment. You made the garment, and then there were strings hanging down from the bottom, so you used it. It can't be that way. Rather, it has to be put on lishma. And minasisin kshera. However, if you have the thread doesn't have to be spun lishma. Sisin are the balls of the thread. Okay? In other words, that thread doesn't have to be made lishma, but when you attach it to the garment, it has to be lishma. That's what what Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav. Ki amrita kamei de Shmuel, and when I said this in front of Shmuel, because Rav was originally a student of Rav. Rav Yehuda was originally a student of Rav, and when Rav died, he went and studied with Shmuel. And when he was studying with Shmuel, he told Shmuel what Rav had said, and Amar li, Av menasisin nami pesula, de ba'inan tevia lishma, that Shmuel disagreed with Rav and said, no, the spinning of the thread also has to be lishma. That's what we say. We say that not only, you can't just go to AC Moore and buy some string and make tzitzit. You have to buy tzitzit that was spun to via lishma for the purpose of tzitzit. So that's a machlokah between Rav and Shmuel. Rav said no, only the hanging and the tying has to be lishma. Shmuel said no, even the spinning had to be lishma. But the point is that it has to be lishma. Now there's a whole other interpretation of this sugya that minakotzin means is referring to tufts of wool that got caught in the thorns when the sheep walked by. That it wasn't removed in the normal way. It wasn't removed with a human purpose in mind.
It would be like a little
it got torn
stuff
up.
on all the houses that are around.
If you made that into tzitzit, it would be like what we're talking about. According to Rashi. Yeah. According to the Rambam, there are other things going on here. According to the Geonim, it's a different concept. But in any case, it's we're sticking with Rashi for now. So again, hachinamini baya sukkah lishma. So the question is, how can it be that Beit Hillel on one hand is saying that the sukkah doesn't have to be made lishma? But on the other hand, they would ostensibly agree with the halacha of Rav and Shmuel that tzitzit has to be put on the shema. So what's the difference between the two? Shani atam da'amar kwa gedilim ta'aselach lach l'shem chovach, because it says gedilim ta'aselach that you have to make threads or you have to make braids or threads on the edge of your garment. So it says ta'aselach, you have to make it for yourself. In other words, it has to be lach l'shem chovach, for the sake of your obligation. In other words, it has to be l'shem mitzvah. There's a special decree that tzitzit has to be affixed l'shem mitzvah.
Affixed or made?
Put on.
I mean, couldn't one take the stuff that's there, the threads that are there,
right,
and make them into tzitzis with the intention this is going to be the tzitzis?
No, it has to be attached to the garment initially for that. That's what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying that it has to be even placed into the garment separately, not that it came there by accident. Now, the Gemara says hachanami chag hasukot taseh lecha. But doesn't it say you should make Chag HaSukkot for yourself? So why is it? So when it comes to tzitzit, when it says Taselach, you say, oh, that means it has to be Lishma. When it says in the Sukkot Taselach, no, that doesn't have to be Lishma. You can't. Why should that be? So why don't you say Lecha L'Shem Chovach? Well, that's coming to teach you Taselach with Sukkot or Taselecha is to teach you it can't be a stolen Sukkah. You can't go to your friend's house, kick him out of his Sukkah, and use it. You're not allowed to do that. So why can't you say the same thing regarding tzitzit? That the only reason why tzitzit says ta'aselach is because the Torah is telling you, don't steal the materials for the tzitzit, don't steal the materials for the sukkah, same concept. So, hatam ketiv kra'acharina v'asul lahem mishalahem. That's because when it comes to tzitzit, we already have a pasuk, v'asul lahem tzitzit. V'asul lahem, it has to be theirs, shalahem. So we already know that in tzitzit. We don't need a pasuk to teach us not to steal. So therefore, when it says ta'aselach, it means do it lishma, do it with intention. But sukkah, the pasuk that sounds like it's telling you ta'aselecha, really means don't steal the materials that you need for the sukkah. The Tosafot goes through a whole discussion here. Don't we already know that? You can't do a mitzvah haba'a ba'avera. You can't do a mitzvah through doing an avera and so on. Why do you need a special pasuk here? And so he discusses that it may be talking about a case where technically you're not violating Gizelah for some reason, but but still it's not yours. Yeah. Now we turn to Amud Bet.
Because there's a rule.
The new Mishnah.
If you find a tzitzit, at the synagogue, and you want to.
Well, that's because the person wouldn't mind you using it, but we're not talking about stealing it. That's borrowing.
But it could be
borrowing is right.
It could be it's just because on something else.
Because we give people a credit.
That doesn't apply on a book. A book you're not allowed to do that.
We give people a credit that they would rather you do the mitzvah with their stuff. But tzitzit is here we're talking about stealing the actual tzitzit.
Oh, the actual.
Yeah. So anyway, now we get to the Mishnah Amud Bet. Somebody makes a sukkah under a tree. He might as well make it inside the house. Okay, sukkah al-gabe sukkah. If you have one sukkah on top of a sukkah, in other words, you decided, I want to live with class. I don't want to have a one level, so I want to have a double sukkah. I want to have an upstairs, downstairs, like not a real house. So what happens? The problem is only the upper one is going to be kasher. Why? Because the lower one is under something else, right? In other words, just like if you make a sukkah under a tree, it's like there's something else covering it. So to here, right, you're making one sukkah under another sukkah. There's a different roof on top of the roof that's over your head. So that's not going to be good. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, if it's not viable to live in the upper sukkah, meaning at the roof that is immediately over your head, which would be the floor of the upper sukkah, if it's not really sustainable as a living space, then the whole thing could be considered one sukkah. It's not really considered it's not considered a sukkah on top of a sukkah. It's considered only one sukkah. Only the lower one is considered valid. Now the Gemara is going to discuss exactly what the parameters are on the next Amud in tomorrow's daf. What the parameters are for defining this, but the concept is basically if you had a structure on top of your sukkah, just like if you had a tree on top of it, it would be invalid. The question is, when you have one sukkah on top of another, first of all, how do we define it? What are the parameters of defining it? It's two sukkot and not just one big one. Okay, with some separation between the schach, but basically it's the same thing. And how do we determine, in other words, that there's something interposing between you and the sukkah above? So we're going to see.
How can you walk on schach?
Well, we'll see. So anyway, the Gemara first deals with the first case. Amar Rav Rava says, "Lo shanu ela be'ilan shetilato merubah mehamato." This is only true when the tree casts more shade than it does sun. In other words, it actually functions as sechach. Aval hamato merubah mitilato keshera. But if it allows sun in other words, there's just some branches over your sukkah, but really they allow a lot of sun through,
that doesn't count.
Then it wouldn't count. Now, mimai, how do you know that? Midekatane, from the fact that the Mishnah says, Ki'ilu asa'ab betoch habayit, because it says if you were to make it in the house. Lama li limitne ki'ilu asa'ab betoch habayit, litne psula. Why does it have to say it's as if you made it in the house? Just say, if you put your sukkah under a tree, it's not valid. Why do you have to describe it as being like doing it in the house? Ela hakamashmalan, it's coming to teach you de'ilan dumyad debayit. It's trying to teach you that the tree is like a house. Ma bayit tilato mirubah mehamato. Just like the house, it provides more shade than light, obviously, because it has a roof. Af ilan tilato mirubah mehamato. So too, this is talking about a tree that provides more shade than it allows light in. In other words, it's like a roof. There's like the trees is functioning as a roof. If we define a roof as something that shades the majority of the space below, then it's functioning as a roof. And that is not That's not acceptable to have on top of your sukkah. Then the Gemara says, but we still have another problem, which is, even though it might only be providing partial shade and it's not enough, the fact is that it's still being incorporated into your sukkah. Okay? In other words, it's still functioning and it's still giving you some shade. And therefore you're benefiting from sechach pasul and sechach kasher. There is sechach that's acceptable and unacceptable at the same time.
One problem that I'm having with the shade is that at what time of the day?
When it's directly overhead. It means when it's directly overhead.
No, okay, but at different times, like sometimes.
No, of course. Sometimes there is no shade because the sun is not up.
Sometimes it provides complete shade because the sun is here.
Maybe you'll say at nighttime it provides complete shade because there's no sun. No. It's talking about when it's directly overhead.
When the sun is directly.
When it's directly overhead. That's the test.
The test is midday.
Right, midday, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
It's got to be. Otherwise, you're right. Otherwise, when the sun just came up, there is no shade.
Right.
My schach is doing great.
Right.
Then it's over me, and the whole thing's lit up, and I see it's not good.
When the sun is
right, when the sun is overhead, must be the measure. Now, so the point is that still you're mixing, you're incorporating sechach pasul into your sechach kasher, because you're benefiting from this trait. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, B'shehavitan. It's talking about where you lowered these branches and actually mixed them in to your sechach, so they're not discernible. So since there's a majority of sechach kasher, and these branches are not discernible because you basically put them under your sechach, they're not discernible as a separate thing, therefore they become batel. Just like if a piece of pork falls into your dafina,
1.60.
right? We say 1/60th, but if you could see the piece of pork floating right there, you can't eat it, right? So to here, if you wrap it into, you incorporate it into your schach, so you can't tell which one is attached to the tray, and which one is separate, and you know that the majority is separate and not attached, then it's kasher. So, if it's talking about a case where you mix them together, why do you have to tell me? Why do you have to mention it? That's obvious. So Rashi says, "Lama leile rava lememar kishera, v'lematnitin lama leile memar kilo asa betoch habayit." In other words, why do you need to have these distinctions? Lashmo inan delo pasul eladum yad habayit. Hai lav tachat shnei sechachimu dekevan dechamatom rubam de'anafav mu'atin uschach kasher rabba alav me'echatiti lemifsal lav mishum shnei sechachim ikad hachad sechachahu. In other words, what Rashi says is that if we're talking about a case where these branches to begin with did not provide a majority of shaded area, number one. Number two, you took it and stuck it into your regular sechach, so they're not discernible anymore. So we can't say it's shnei sechachim. You can't say there are two roofs here, because one of them is now incorporated into your sechach kasher. And since the sechach kasher comprises a majority, therefore it's batel. So what would be the question? Why would this even be a question? Rather, you might think we should make a gezerah here. You might have thought that we should make a gezerah, a decree, that perhaps this person will not take this tree and mix it in properly. It will be clearly discernible. And then you will have the problem of two sechachim. You'll have the problem of having two coverings over your sukkah. One that's kasher and one that's pasul. And even though that tree is not incorporated, in other words, even though that tree is not providing more shade than light, still, the fact that it's hanging over your sukkah is going to be like having two roofs. That's what the Gemara seems to be saying. Okay,
Even though before they said it doesn't count.
Right, it doesn't count, but then it said that's only if you mixed it together.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
That's only if it didn't mix it together. But if you didn't mix it together and it's discernibly distinct right there hanging over your sukkah, it's no good. Okay, so now the Gemara says, and the chidush is that even though in order to make it kasher, you have to take those branches and push them into your schach kasher so they're not discernible. And you might think maybe we should make a gezerah. You're going to forget to do that. No, we don't make such a gezerah. You're allowed to do it. But still, again, hanami tanena. But we learned about this already in a Mishnah. Hidla ala et gefen. If you lowered upon the sechach gefen, the vine, v'ata dilaat, or you lowered the dilaat, which again, these are various vegetation. Veta kisus. Again, that sounds like ivy, okay? Because it says that it's mitpashet, right? It's grass that's along the wall, right? So all the various kinds of vegetation, you take them and and v'sichech al gaban pisula. So if you put them on your sukkah, these attached items, the ivy, you don't want to kill the ivy, right? So you just drape it over the sukkah. Look how nice it looks, Now, that is, it says that's not allowed. However, but if you had a majority of sechach kasher, or you cut them from their source of growth, keshera, okay, then it would be kasher. In other words, what it's saying is that, okay, you draped the ivy over your sukkah, you thought it looked really nice, but then the rabbi said, that doesn't count, you have to, so then you cut it.
Like a pergola, the purpose of a pergola is to actually do that, to have a vine that goes on top and, serves as the...
Right, so it's like a covering, it's like a shade, yeah, it's very nice. So if the sukkah is covered with such a thing, it wouldn't be good because it's still attached to the source of growth. But if you had a majority of kasher sechach, or you cut it, it would be good. So hechidami, what are we talking about here? If you're telling me that they didn't lower the sukkah, in other words, they didn't take the sechach kasher and cover the sechach that wasn't kasher, if they didn't do that, then how could it be allowed? That wouldn't be possible. You have a clearly discernible pasul thing hanging over your sechach. That wouldn't be good. Rather, it must be saying that you mixed it together. And you see from this that you don't make a gezerah. In other words, we don't say that, you might forget to intermingle them properly, so we don't allow you to rely on that. So the Gemara says, Ma'ud detema. So why do you need both of these teachings? Why do you need our Mishnah to tell you that there's a way to or Ravat to teach you, that there's a way to get around the problem of having a tree branch hanging over your sukkah, which is to lower it and to put all the kasher sechach on top of it? And why do you need the Mishnah too? Because you might have thought that that's only b'diavad, because the Mishnah says hidla et gefen. If you already did it, and now you want a way to salvage what you did, so then you can put the extra sechach on top. But maybe you might think you're not allowed to do it lechatchila. Kamashmalan, what the Gemara is coming to tell you is that you're allowed to. You're allowed to do it lechatchila. You're allowed to. You see a branch there. You want to put your sukkah there? Okay, put your sukkah there. Lower the branch and put the kasher sechach on top of it. You're allowed to do it lechatchila. We're not worried that you're going to make a mistake. We'll go a little bit further. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, and according to the side, it should say basukot without a vav. Okay, basukot teshivu velo besukkah shetachat sukkah, because it says sukkot, it says sukat without a vav. So that means that it should be not a sukkah that's under another sukkah, velo besukkah shetachat ilan, and not a sukkah that is under a tree, and not in a sukkah that's under a house. In other words, not like the Karaim do, by the way, or the Samaritans. What do? If you ever see what the Samaritans do, the Shomronim, they make their sukkah in the house. They sit in a sukkah in the house. Right? It's symbolic. To them, it's symbolic. We're sitting in a sukkah. Look. Would they decorate it with all kinds of things that you're not allowed to decorate it with, the fruits and all that? Like for the schach. And they sit in the sukkah in the house. So he says no. The Braita here is saying you're not allowed to do that. Adiraba basukot tarte mashma. The Gemara asks. On the contrary, basukot sounds like two. It sounds like you could have a double-decker sukkah, one on top of the other. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak basukot ketiv. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says basukot is written without a vav, as if it were to say basukat. And since bisukat is how it's written, we say it means one sukkah, not two. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Apparently, the Shomronim did not get the memo on that, and therefore they did it two on purpose. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, "Pa'amim sheshten kesherot, pa'amim sheshten pesula, pa'amim shetachtona keshera, v'elyona pesula, pa'amim shetachtona pesula, v'elyona keshera." There are times. Now we're talking about our sukkah, which is one on top of the other. There are times when both of them could be kasher, times when neither of them would be kasher, times when the top would be kasher, and times when the bottom would be kasher. In other words, there are times when top would but bottom wouldn't, or bottom would or top wouldn't, or both of them would be or both of them wouldn't be, says Rabbi Yirmiyah. We'll just do the first one because it goes all the way into the next Amud. So it says, what is the case where both of them could be kasher? Kegon she'atachtona hamata miruba mitzilata va'elyona tzilata miruba mehamata v'kayima elyona betoch esrim. That what you could have is like this: the lower sukkah has sechach, which is functioning as the floor of the upper sukkah. Okay? Now how does it work? That the upper sukkah has proper sechach. Its sechach is tzilato merubah mechamato. In other words, it provides more shade than sunlight. So it's kasher. The lower sechach, which is the floor of the upper sukkah, that one has non-kosher sechach. In other words, the sechach is kasher, but it doesn't have enough. In other words, if you only had that lower one, it wouldn't count as sechach because it provides too much sun. So what does that mean? What's your real roof? The upper one. And the upper one then what? Has to be within 20 amot of the floor.
The bottom.
Of the bottom of the ground. Because in other words, when would they both be kasher? When the lower one is not kasher. Meaning the lower one is not a sukkah in its own right. Because its roof, because whatever's in the middle is nothing. Okay?
Maybe you put it there as a support system.
Right, it's a support, or you wanted to be able to do something. I don't know, who knows what.
But it's something between you and the schach.
But it's not. But since it doesn't count as a roof in its own right, it's
but
okay.
Still, if you're sitting on the lower floor, right, the ground floor,
Right.
and the upper schach is the kosher schach,
Right.
then this other floor,
These other things are. But since that thing itself is not right, that's true. But since it's not sufficient to make its own roof, it won't make it pasul.
So it's as if it's not there.
It's as if it's not there. And then the next case, when would they both be pasul? When you have that both of them are sechach kasher. In other words, but the upper one is higher than 20 amot. So the lower one is not kasher because it has the upper one above it. Okay? The upper one above it ruins it. So even though the lower roof, which would be the second floor's ground, the second floor's floor, that lower roof could be a kasher sechach, but the problem is that it's underneath the upper one. And the upper one is above 20 amot, so it wouldn't be good either. So even if you were to stand in the upper one, it wouldn't be good because its roof is over 20 amot. So either one you stood in would not be good. The lower one wouldn't be good because your roof is underneath another roof. And the upper level, second floor, wouldn't be good because the roof of that one is too high. Okay? When is it that the lower one is kasher and the upper one is pasul? In a case where the lower one has proper sechach, okay, but where the upper one is not valid sechach, it has less, less covering than light, than open. So it's not valid. So we wouldn't say so if you're sitting in the lower one, we would say you are underneath your perfectly good sechach, and what's above your perfectly good sechach is not a valid roof because it's just a few branches. It's not enough. But if you were sitting in the upper floor, you would be under an invalid roof. Okay, so that wouldn't be good. And there are cases where the lower one would be invalid, but the upper one would be kasher. And the case where the upper one is kasher is if that one's obvious, right? Where they're both sechach kasher, and they're both within 20 amot. In other words, before we said, why would the upper one be invalid and the lower one why would they both be invalid? When the lower one is invalid because it's underneath the upper one. They're both thick enough to be schach, but the upper one is higher than 20 amot, so it's invalid for a different reason, and the lower one is invalid because it's underneath the upper one. Okay, but if the lower one is completely thick enough to be sechach, the only problem is it's underneath the upper one. But you're in the second floor, and the second floor is not taller than 20 amot, then you would be able to use the second floor as your sukkah.
Even though the bottom is...
Even though the bottom is not kasher, would just serve as, it's just a platform. Right. Meaning,
I'm sorry.
the schach is kasher if it didn't have another schach over it.
But I thought this was the case of both kosher.
No, this is the case where only the upper one is kasher.
Okay.
The lower one is kasher, is invalid because of the upper one, but the upper one is kasher in and of itself. So in other words, the point of Rabbi Yirmiyah here is to say that yes, you're not allowed to have a sukkah on a sukkah. The Mishnah sounds like it means that you can't have if you have a sukkah gabe sukkah elyona kshera b'tachtona psula, that's a categorical statement that whenever you have a sukkah on top of another sukkah, the upper one is good and the lower one is not good. That's not absolutely true. It really depends. Now, technically, it is absolutely true because if you have a kosher sukkah on top of a kosher sukkah, only the top one will be good because the bottom one sechach is going to be invalidated by the upper one sechach being over it.
So how can you,
right? So if they are both, it's not. Why I'm calling it we're using the term kosher in two different ways. Okay, let's step back. We're using the term kasher in two different ways. Kasher could mean meets the specifications of schach, or kasher could mean you can use the sukkah. Okay, that's two different things.
So it's kasher.
So in other words, so maybe that's a better way to say it, so it's clearer, right? So if the upper and lower one both meet the specifications of schach, but the problem is that one is on top of the other. That's the best way to put it. So then the Mishnah is exactly right. The upper one will be kasher, the lower one will not be kasher. But Rabbi Yirmiyah is just telling you could have a situation of a double-decker kind of sukkah where the lower one could be kasher. Why? Because the upper one doesn't have sechach that meets specifications. Right? Or you could have a situation where they're both not valid because the lower one meets specifications and the upper one meets specifications, but the height is too high in the upper one, or some other reason. So he's just trying to tell you that it's not an absolute rule. You have to look at more factors than just one.